I'd like to give a really warm welcome to everyone here who's come to attend the fourth International Conference in the Unfinished Legacy of B.R. Ambedkar. And the conference theme, as you know, is on caste and race and reconfiguring solidarities. I'm Sangeeta Kamath from the College of Education, and my co-chair for the conference here is Amilcar Shahbaz. He's the chair of the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-Am Studies. And we want to really extend a very warm welcome to people who have traveled from afar to come to this conference. There are many of you who have really traveled, from India, from different parts of the country to come and attend this. And I also want to say that we're really heartened by the very positive response this conference theme received. There was so much interest that it generated, and a lot of people telling us that this was something so timely and something that they really wanted to engage with. So I just want to thank all of you for being here, and I'm hoping that you're going to take something back to your own institutions and places of work. We have an extraordinary panel of speakers this evening, and I know we're all really very eager to hear from them, but I don't want to take up too much time. But it would be very remiss of me if I were not to take a few moments to recognize the individuals who contributed to making this conference possible. Foremost, of course, our Chancellor Kumle Subbaswamy. Unfortunately, he could not be here, but he was the one who really supported this conference and the concept. The Dean of the College of Education, Cynthia Gerstle-Pepin, who is here. Anna Branch, Associate Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion, who's going to be speaking to you in a little bit. And what I want to just really, highlight here is that I'm really, to have university leadership who are committed to these issues is no small matter, especially in these times. And I just want to say how heartened, grateful I am for that. I want to also recognize, along with Shahbaz, we want to recognize the members of the conference committee who assisted in all parts of the conference planning. There's Priyanka Srivastava from History and Economics, Vamsi Vakulabarnam from Economics, Bharat Rathod from the College of Education, Gaurav Pathania from the College of Education, Dwaipayan Sen from Amherst College, and Suraj Yangre from Harvard University. The other thing that I also want to draw your attention to is that this conference departs from most academic conferences in that the community organizations in the Indian diaspora, specifically Ambedkarite organizations, have been participating in this endeavor over the last 3 years that this conference has happened, and have been very involved also in helping us put this conference together. I want to say a special thank you to the Boston Study Group, who are a co-sponsor of the conference and have contributed in very important ways to the program. We're also grateful to the many student volunteers who have made time to both host students visiting from India for this conference and are assisting us through the weekend. For those of you who may not be very aware of the history of this conference, I want to say that there's a very special contribution that has been made by Professor Lawrence Simon from Brandeis University and Sukhdev Thorat from JNU, the University in Delhi. And we really owe this conference series to their vision and leadership. They initiated this conference series on the unfinished legacy of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar 3 years ago. And since then, actually, both Afro-Am Studies Department and myself and a few other colleagues have been very involved in this conference from the get-go. I also have to thank two people who are nowhere mentioned in the program but did enormous work to make this conference happen. Bal Murli Natarajan, who's here somewhere in the audience, and Biju Matthew. They helped us really conceptualize the conference and its interlinked themes. If you see that we're really moving from the experiential and the interpersonal to the social in terms of violence and and institutional and structural violence, and really trying to connect all of these different aspects of how caste and race manifests itself. So I really want to thank both of them for making an enormous contribution to this conference, personally reaching out to the many outstanding speakers who are part of the conference. As is clear from the conference theme, I think one of the things that we really want, what the aim of this conference is to bring about a rigorous and we hope long-lasting exchange between Dalit studies and caste studies scholars, and race studies and Black studies scholars, to build an intellectual and political collaboration that learns from the history and theoretical forays of previous generations, but with an emphasis to think anew, right, about the contemporary predicament we are in. with Trump in the White House and Modi in the Prime Minister's office, I just want to share, by the way, this is a picture of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, because I know most people are very familiar with Gandhi in this country, but very few people know what Ambedkar looks like. So I really want you to also get to know Ambedkar. So, what I want, situate this conference, the purpose of this conference also in the context of what's happening internationally, globally, and between these two countries. So on the one hand, we have Trump in the White House and Modi in the Prime Minister's office in Delhi, both elected leaders that champion white supremacy and white Hindu nationalism, respectively. And both parties who see themselves as partners in a common cause, right? So here you have Hindu nationalists actually in India trying to do a special prayer ceremony to have Trump elected, right? So this was in fall of 2016, right there in New Delhi, right, in the heart of the city. So here, one can sort of recognize just from this kind of partnership that has emerged that we're at a very dangerous political conjuncture. We face the real and palpable prospect of not only losing the very limited gains of civil and political liberties and minority rights and protections of the last 60 years, and this is, I think, in a sense, the shortcomings of liberalism that that it offers us these kinds of limited gains. But we're also faced with the prospect of return of an illiberal, authoritarian, and maybe even fascistic and violent state in society, both in India and the U.S., and perhaps even beyond. When one follows political events today, there's some really alarming signs in so many different countries, and this really. I think compels us to put race, we should be compelled by these events to put race and caste front and center in our analysis and social justice struggles. And I think it's nothing short of an absolute imperative that we do so. Whether these are struggles against neoliberal capitalism, land, ecology, environmental struggles, education, health, urban reform, work, whatever our respective areas of research, scholarship, and political engagements, I do think, and this is something that we're really sort of wanting to make, as a plea, that we must foreground very seriously and deeply questions of race and caste. And our work must be informed by racial justice and anti-caste perspective if we are to construct a new political horizon of a just democracy. And I think what you're going to see in this conference, both tonight and over the weekend, is really the work of presenters and speakers at this conference who really reflect this conviction and commitment, right? Where race and caste are really at the forefront of whatever area of research that they're undertaking. And also, I want you to kind of keep in mind that, again, it's not that everyone agrees with each other here. They're all coming with really very different analysis, different perspectives, different kinds of, and theoretical emphasis. And it's our responsibility this weekend to really listen, to be attentive, and engage with the different and wide-ranging perspectives, and to really both contend with them and see, where is it that we can maybe find some new kinds of common grounds and openings to work together. Okay, so these are sort of, my comments just to set the conference in context. And what I want to do now is to turn to Professor Anna Branch, who's going to make some opening remarks. And it's a real pleasure and privilege for me to introduce you to her and her work to you. She leads the campus diversity efforts that is really engaged in institutionalizing a climate of equity and inclusion on our campus. Anna Branch was also part of the delegation to New Delhi in February this year to release the report on inclusive universities, a study that we jointly did along with Pune University. And her research is on race, racism and inequality, intersectional theory, work and occupations, and historical demography. Her book, Opportunity Denied, Limiting Black Women to Devalued Work, provides an overview of the historical evolution of Black women's work and socioeconomic structures that have located them in particular and devalued places in the US labor market. And of course, she's published widely in a lot of the top sociology journals, as well as Race, Gender and Class, and Journal of Black Studies. And she's currently investigating rising employment insecurity in the post-industrial era through the lens of race and gender inequality. And I can think of no one better to open the conference for us. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at UMass Amherst, and thank you to all for making the trip. I know, and some of you came from very far. Special welcome to our guests from India. I hope that time travel and time change treats you well. When we had the great pleasure of joining Sangeeta, myself, Cindy, and the extended campus delegation, the chancellor was with us as well, the time change was substantial, so welcome. I know the transition is substantial. So UMass Amherst has been in close partnership, in part led through Sangeeta's efforts with our partners, and we were in India, New Delhi, most recently in February, for the release or the celebration of Inclusive Universities, a partnership between the U.S., the India Education Foundation, and Pune University in particular, thinking about what does it mean to link diversity, equity, and excellence in the 21st century. And I think in part the conversation is, oh, sure. Sorry, I'm being summoned. I'm not loud today.
Oh, you could just
You can just move to your left if you have a mic.
Yeah.
More loud?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, it's been a very long day. So when we were in New Delhi several months ago now for the Inclusive Universities Conference, it was a great opportunity to start and really continue and bring more individuals to a conversation that had been going on between UMass Amherst and Pune about what does it mean to link diversity, equity, and excellence in the 21st century. And a lot of the trends that we've seen in the US around educational expansion are increasing in India now. And part of the conversation that's promoting on the ground is the proliferation, extension, and the amplification of voices questioning place and position and limitations in society. And that discussion around what does caste mean, what are limitations, how do we understand who has access, who belongs within the university, and how do we ensure that there is equity and integration, not separation that persists, is a real part of where that conversation began. That study, one of the first climate studies done in India that was released, really started the conversation and invited many others in to think about what that means. And it was a call for a new engagement of research and scholars in the next steps. We had the privilege of speaking at the JNU campus later after the report was released. And the conversation from the students that packed the room was really kind of a call of the next generation of scholarship and to the scholars that are gathered in this room to push that conversation forward. So I'm really delighted that you're here, that the scholarship will continue, and UMass Amherst, our chancellor, our leadership, our deans, our faculty stand ready to partner, to be in conversation, and to really help lead the efforts that take us to the next step. So a special thank you to Sangeeta and to Alankar, both our co-chairs of this conference. I wish you a lovely stay. I unfortunately will not be able to stay for the entire conference, but I was really delighted to be with you tonight. Thank you so much.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. Let's try again. Good evening. Good evening. Oh, there we go. It's Friday. Let me make sure we're all awake. I'm Barbara Krauthammer. I'm professor of history and dean of the graduate school here at UMass Amherst. And it's my great pleasure to be a part of this conference. I was thrilled when my colleague Priyanka Shrivastava invited me to take part in this. And it's my pleasure tonight to welcome you all to the opening plenary, Caste and Race, Reconfiguring Solidarities. So I'm going to introduce our three speakers, and then you will hear from each of them, and then we will have some time at the end for conversation among the three of you, and then questions and discussion with the audience. Our speakers tonight, first are Isabel Wilkerson. Isabel Wilkerson is a Pulitzer-Prize winner and National Humanities Medalist. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Warmth of Other Suns. Isabel spent 15 years working on what can only be described, I think, as a majestic book, in which she interviewed over 1,200 people to tell the story of one of the greatest underreported aspects of American history in the 20th century, that of the Great Migration of African Americans. The book won many awards that really take up about half a page of my introductory notes. So in the interest of time, I'll hit the highlights. The National Book Critics Circle Award, the Heartland Prize for Nonfiction, the Anisfield Wolf Award for Nonfiction. It was shortlisted for the Penn Galbraith Literary Award. The Warmth of Other Suns was named to the list of 30 best books of the year by the New York Times, 10 best books of the year, and best books of the year by Amazon, the New Yorker, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post, among other outlets. Finally, Isabel Wilkerson's book made national news when President Obama chose the book for his summer reading list in 2011. And then in 2012, the New York Times Magazine named the book to its list of best nonfiction books of all time. In addition to this, as if this weren't enough, Isabel Wilkerson received the Pulitzer-Prize for her work as the Chicago bureau chief of the New York Times in 1994, making her the first African-American woman in the history of the prize to receive, in the history of American journalism, to win a Pulitzer Prize. And she was the first African-American to win the prize for individual reporting. Our next speaker will be Professor Gopal Guru, who is an eminent political theorist and scholar in his own right, and a highly regarded teacher who's based at the Center for Political Studies at the JNU campus in New Delhi. Later this year, Professor Guru is scheduled to assume the editorship of one of India's most respected academic journals, the Economic and Political Weekly. His numerous writings on political theory, radical democracy, Dalit subjectivity, and cultural political histories explore experiences of casteism and the philosophical basis of untouchability. And his work has been formative in the field of South Asian studies and also in the Indian public sphere. He's written numerous articles and books, including the monograph Atrophy in Dalit Politics and the acclaimed volumes Cracked Mirror, An Indian Debate on Theory and Experience, and also Humiliation, Claims, and Context. In February of 2016, Professor Guru gave the inaugural teach-in lecture on nationalism at JNU, at a time when the university was under considerable attack from right-wing forces. Those lectures have since been collected in another volume titled What the Nation Needs to Know, the JNU Nationalism Lectures, that was published by HarperCollins India in 2017. Our third presenter this evening is Dr. Meena Danda, who is a reader in philosophy and cultural politics at the University of Wolverhampton. She migrated from the Indian Punjab to the UK as a Commonwealth scholar at Oxford University in 1987. Since then, she's published 2 books, a monograph, The Negotiation of Personal Identity, and Reservations for Women. From 2007, Dr. Danda has engaged in transdisciplinary studies connected with caste, race, and published several papers, again, that take up about half of my page. So again, in the interest of hearing the speakers, I will skip through some of them, but simply say that most of them focus on issues of caste, gender, family, and social relations. From September 2013 to February of 2014, she led a consortium for the UK Equality and Human Rights Commission on Caste in Britain, which produced 2 critical reports that went on to form a key reference for British public consultation on how caste discrimination must be legally addressed by the UK Government Equalities Office. So please take a moment now to join me in welcoming our 3 speakers and listening to their questions.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that really nice introductions. I have just 2 announcements to make. One is to have your phones on silent. Well, actually 3 announcements. Your phone on silent, to have also for you to know that this whole event is being video recorded, and there'll also be an audio podcast of it. And the third thing is that for those of you who tweet, the hashtag for tweetings at this conference is Caste Race 2018. Thank you.
Good evening. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here to speak before you.
Well, I think you have to step
Oh,
to the right.
I see.
Okay.
I don't have a problem standing here. I'm happy to be here. Thank you. I can't tell you what an honor it is for me to be here. I have spent more time than I sometimes want to admit on this book. This is my copy of The Warmth of Other Suns, which is putatively the story about the Great Migration of African Americans, 6 million African Americans who fled the Jim Crow South from the time of World War I until the 1970s. And that is putatively what the book is about. This is my actual tour copy. The book came out in 2010. It has worked its way into the hearts and minds of so many people that it's literally kept me on the road for 8 years. I've been on the road 8 years with this book. And so that's why it almost looks like it's 15 years old itself. So I often say that if this book were a human being, it would be in high school and dating, because that's how long it took me to work on this. Now, while I was working on this book, I interviewed over 1,200 people who were survivors of what is euphemistically known as the Jim Crow South. And in the process of doing that, I had the chance to hear the experiences of people who, anthropologists of that era, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, when the Jim Crow system was in place. These are anthropologists who referred to it as a caste system. I didn't set out to be writing about the caste system. I had not really thought about caste as it applied to the United States. But after spending 15 years on this book, interviewing over 1,200 people for this book, and also doing tremendous amount of archival work to recreate an era that does not formally exist anymore in the United States formally, but the residue of which we live with to this day, because it's ultimately the DNA of the United States social system and the ways that people interact with one another. So I actually thought I was writing about migration, and it turned out that I was actually writing about freedom and how far people are willing to go to achieve it, and the fact that these are people who were seeking freedom from a caste system. They were defecting a caste system. This is the only group of Americans who had to act like immigrants in order to be recognized as the citizens that they had always been. No other group of Americans has had to act like an immigrant in order to be recognized as an American. And so the point of all of this research was to recreate this world so that those of us alive today can understand and see the origins of the world of the society, the culture in the United States that we live with to this day. And so in doing so, that meant that I had to look at aspects that go far beyond what we think we know about Jim Crow. All of us know about the water fountains and the restrooms, and in fact, little children learn about this in school in February in the United States, so that in March you could ask any second grader and they can tell you about the water fountains and the restrooms. And so that would not be sufficient to describe this era, to describe this hierarchy as a caste system. But I want to lay out to you some of the examples that convinced me of the usefulness, of the appropriateness, and of the accuracy that anthropologists of the day chose to use to describe this caste, to describe the United States, particularly the South, as a caste system. So one of the issues has to do with, one of the hallmarks of a caste system, of course, would be endogamy. And endogamy was the law of the land for much of the United States, involving what would be called the upper caste with any non-white person for much of United States history. So endogamy was very much a part of the Jim Crow South, that the world that the people in the Great Migration, African Americans, were leaving. I should preface it by saying that this tremendously affected African Americans because 90% of all African Americans were living in the South, where this caste system emerged, was codified, and was violently enforced to such a degree that every 4 days, somewhere in the American South, an African American was lynched for some perceived breach of the caste system. It was extremely important that people know and stay in their place in the American caste system known as Jim Crow. Another aspect of or characteristic of a caste system would be the issue of purity and pollution. And that is something that we often will say, well, of course, if you had water fountains and restrooms, then very clearly there was a concern about keeping people separate. But the water fountains and the restrooms only begin to speak to the level of specificity and the extent to which people were separated for fear of polluting one group due to the purity of the other group. And so, so I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them is that it was commonly known that African Americans were not to go they were forced to go into certain doors. They had to go to the side doors, the back doors of whatever establishment they were going into. It was so considered so out of the order of the caste system that it was said that very few people in the South had so much as shaken the hand of a person of a different race. But the example I want to really share with you is one that I became aware of in the process of looking for examples to make this come alive for people today. And so I found myself going through the archives. It was in the 1940s, North Carolina. Came across a headline that made reference to the Jim Crow Bible. And so I thought, well, how would you have, and why would you have, what could possibly be a Jim Crow Bible? It turned out that it was made the front page of the newspaper in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it didn't make it in the paper because because it was a new law, it had been in place for quite some time. It didn't make it in the paper because people were appalled or surprised at this. The only reason it made it in the paper that day, because this was the system under which they were living. And the only reason it made it in the paper that day was because on that particular day, there had been a trial in session, and they had to suspend the trial because they could not find the Black Bible. Someone was to take the witness stand, and they could not find the Black Bible. So instead of continuing with the trial and letting this person touch the white Bible, they actually suspended the trial. Court officers, bailiffs, the deputies all had to comb the courthouse in order to find the Bible so that they could resume the trial. The very Word of God was segregated in the caste system of the American South, which became the template for the residue of what we will live with to this day. But also it meant that the same sacred object could not be touched by hands of different races. So there was the idea that the very Word of God, which was in some ways the foundation of the belief system for many of the people who were the architects of the caste system, that very sacred object could not be touched by African Americans and whites by the same object. There were many other examples of a very prominent situation that would occur in the North, actually, where an African American might go to a restaurant and order something to drink, and it was they would be provided that, which might not have been possible in the South, where it was so segregated that African Americans could not eat in the same establishments. Again, purity and pollution. But it turned out that in the North, where things were presumably more lax, more open, it turned out that the proprietors would often go to great trouble to show that African Americans were polluting the implements that they were using. And so after an African American might have had a drink from something that had been presented to them, that they had paid for, they purchased, the proprietor would then make a show of breaking the glass in front of them as a reminder that this glass could no longer be used by anyone else in the establishment, by no other customer could use this glass because it had now been defiled by this person of the lowest caste in the United States. And then another aspect of caste that we often think about has to do with the categories of labor, who could do what in a particular system. And of course, going back to the time of enslavement, African Americans were, by definition, doing the dirtiest, most dangerous, most defiling work that could be done by anyone. They were doing it by force. They were doing it without pay. And I should remind everyone, they did it. Went on for 246 years. African Americans have been on this soil for far longer than there had even been a republic. African Americans were on this soil for 150 years before the United States became the United States, before the Declaration of Independence. African Americans arrived in 1619, and for 12 generations were enslaved and did the absolute dirtiest work, the worst kind of work that needed to be done to build this young nation. And after the end of enslavement in 1865, there then set in motion this formal caste system known as Jim Crow, in which there were some states, such as South Carolina, there were parts of South Carolina in which there were laws that were enacted that would require African Americans could only do agricultural work or servant work. So this was the servant caste of the United States, and it was very much understood to be so. So that if an African American was actually found outside of the expected role that had been assigned for them, there were going to be consequences for doing that. And one very prominent case involved the mother of the NBA legend, Bill Russell, whose parents were from Louisiana, and his mother was walking downtown one day, and she was walking in her Sunday best, and a police officer, the enforcers of the caste system in that world, came up to her and told her she should take that off immediately, go home, take that off immediately, and never to be seen in that again, because it was not fit for her. That was only fit for a white woman, meaning someone in the upper caste. His father, Bill Russell's father, experienced the policing and enforcement of the caste system when he wanted to just get gas one particular day in Monroe, Louisiana. He was standing there getting gas, and one of the rules and precepts of the caste system in the United States at that time was that African Americans had to step aside and wait no matter how long they had been there. If a white customer came in, they had to step aside and wait. So they could be there for a very long time, waiting to get their ice cream, waiting to get a sandwich, waiting to get their gas, which was the case for Bill Russell. And so Bill Russell's father. Bill Russell was there waiting to get gas, and every time he thought he would be able to fill up his tank, there came a white motorist who got there and could get in front of him. And so he was waiting and waiting and waiting, and he decided, this is going on for so long and I need to get going, and he sought to back out in order to get gas. And the proprietor of the gas station, of an upper caste person, came to him with a shotgun and held the gun to his head, and he said, "You will leave when I say you can leave." And that was a way of enforcing this caste system, which was literally a matter of life and death for people in that world. And so these are some of the hallmarks of the caste system. These are the realities of the infrastructure, the social infrastructure of the United States that has had continuing after effects for those of us today. And some of the examples that you can see is that every week there is some new video, some new evidence, some new situation in which an African American, again, African Americans singularly, it appears, to be targeted for violence, targeted for enforcement of not being stepping outside of their place, of being, of essentially being arrested for being in a Starbucks, for example, of being wrestled to the ground, a woman wrestled to the ground by male, very broad-shouldered male police officers at a Waffle House for being there. Simply being there and asking for a fork, and she was wrestled to the ground. She was exposed on this video. These are the kinds of things that have just happened. This is just the last 2 weeks, and this is not going back to previous examples in which we have literally, as a nation, and also as the world, because these videos go out to the world, we have been witness to the dehumanization, continuing stigmatization, and in some ways pariah status of people who are literally killed before our eyes. Americans watched Philando Castile die before our eyes in Minnesota. And the police officer in that case was not held accountable in that case. He was not, there were no consequences ultimately for him. And in terms of the legal system. And so these are things that are going on in our day that are inheritances from the foundational caste system as it existed in the United States. And I wanted to say one other thing about the reason that I worked on this was because I wanted to be able to find ways to understand how do we bridge across this gap, this divide to understanding across caste. And I hoped that there would be a way that people could see themselves in someone who the entire culture has said is beneath them, the entire culture has said is completely different from them, and the entire culture has actually said might not even be human. And so one of the ways that I knew that this book actually had done its work was it got lots of wonderful awards, but I knew that it had done its work when the book had first come out and I was speaking at this event out in Long Island, New York. And it was the room was packed and I'd given the talk. I have been using the word, I should say that the word racism does not appear in the book. I should say that. The word racism does not appear in this book, even though there are many, many people who would say, well, this is all about racism. And I chose not to use racism in the book because I found the more that I studied the history, the more I spent time with the people who had endured this era that I'm speaking about, and then I see what's going on even now. I began to believe that racism, fraught a word as it is, misunderstood a word as it is not sufficient to describe the rigidity and the depth of investment that so many people have in maintaining an artificial hierarchy in which in this caste system everything that you could and could not do was based upon what you look like, and things that are happening to people today are based upon what they look like. And so I felt that the word racism did not quite capture the level of investment in an artificial hierarchy that has structure to it, not just feeling, not just prejudice, not just I don't like these people. It has to do with an investment in a structure that puts people on a value system based upon what they look like. And so as I have gone out talking about this book, I don't use the word racism in anything that I do now because this is the focus of what I do. I have found that it has opened the hearts and minds of people. It's been liberating to be able to see a kind of, it's almost like X-ray vision of being able to see the superstructure of a system that you live in, but you hadn't thought of it that way. It was mind expanding for many people. And I found that as people read the book, I have not gotten complaints about, well, why do you use that? In fact, a lot of people have said that it helped them to better understand the country in which they lived, and particularly for African Americans, the world in which they had grown up. And so as I was just completing this with you, I wanted to just finish the story about the library in Long Island. So it was a large group of people, it was a large crowd that had come out, and at the end of the lecture, there was a signing line that actually went around the perimeter of the room. And at the front of the signing line was a woman. She was a grandmotherly figure. She was very small, a very diminutive woman, and I wondered how she had managed to elbow her way to the front of the line. And there she was. She stood before me. Her eyes were welling up with tears as she stood before me. Her eyes were red and welling up with tears. And she had all these books in her arms that she bought for her family and friends. And she said to me, she said, I can't talk about the book. She said, I can't even begin to talk about the book because if I start talking about the book, I will cry for sure. She said, I can't talk about the book because the book is my story. She said, I'm an immigrant from Greece, and this is my story. And so what I had hoped would come through was a recognition of a common humanity and a recognition of the entry points and portals to privilege, entry points and portals to caste, entry points and portals to where one fits in the in whatever the hierarchy is that you're born into. And a recognition that if you can allow your mind and heart to go to that place of understanding and empathy for those who may be very different from you, then perhaps there is a way to cross this divide. And also to see how we all suffer as a result of this caste system. We all suffer as a result, even those who are the putative beneficiaries of the caste system suffer. I often say that in this caste system of the South, it meant that there was such a waste of energy, such a waste of talent, such a waste of creativity and intelligence. You know, on those cotton fields and on those rice plantations and on those sugar plantations and on those tobacco plantations were opera singers and jazz musicians and playwrights and novelists and poets and engineers and professors and journalists and all kinds of people. And how do we know that? We know that because that is what they and their children and their grandchildren often became after they had the chance to be free to pursue what was actually the talent that was within them all along, but which could have gone fallow had they not escaped the caste system of the Jim Crow South to the marginally freer space of the North. And I think that the reminder to all of us of what was lost by and what can be lost by the tremendous wasted energy that's spent on trying to hold people down. And that's because even the putative beneficiaries are losing, because if you're going to hold someone down in a ditch, you have to get in the ditch with them. And while you're down in the ditch holding them there, and they're being held down in the ditch, neither of you are able to be all that you can be. Neither of you are able to live up to your God-given talents, whatever they may be. So this is a tremendous loss to our country, the United States, that this caste system has been in effect and that we still live with the after effects of it. It's a tremendous loss to any place in the world where there are these artificial hierarchies, no matter what may have been the originating justification for them. And I believe that this is a long-standing issue that it's high time that we put these pieces together of these different puzzles. So thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Do you have a PowerPoint?
No. Good evening, friends, both male and female. I must thank the organizers for getting me here to speak to you this evening. I must particularly thank Sangeeta and Murli for tolerating my idiosyncrasies. I was not very sure whether I could make it because the situation in jail is not very encouraging. So I was not very sure about my coming because the exams are. Yeah. So, Mike. Yeah? Okay.
Just read.
He's going to put it on your. He's going to put it on your lookout.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Don't call this 1 minute, huh? Yeah. Yeah, this is better. Is it working? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I thank Sangeeta and Murli, and I also thank the chairperson on this particular panel for introducing me in so many generous words. And I'm really pleased to share my ideas with you, along with two very distinguished panelists. I must thank, I was damn impressed by Professor Isabella's comparison between race and caste. though we studied and we read the Jim Crow in the South, but we thought it was an official matter that the police person is interested in implementing this law. You have formal arrangement to introduce law. In India, we have everybody as a police person. So every upper caste is a police person to implement these caste-based laws. So that's one comparison that one can. There are several levels of comparison. I'm not going to go into it, but I'm very happy that you just opened up the debate and the possibility of actually producing solidarities between race and caste, at least at the level of understanding and theory. And you are. I'm not going to be a discussion of your talk, but what was very fascinating was the idea of race. Race is not the proper category to get and gain the depth of the understanding of race. It is so multi-layered and it is so deep that the superficial understanding of race may not help you to gain that depth. And so there is some, so I think that there are two levels of understanding race. One is the extraordinary understanding of race, where race becomes very superficial, and there is ordinary understanding of race, where you have to go deeper into the multi-layeredness of this race. So my talk is very much similar to what you have actually initiated. So thank you very much for giving a lead to us. I'm just trying to read out my presentation just for change. I don't normally read. But if I want to undermine the force of jet lag, I must read out. So that's my purpose. Murli already has experience. I'm already getting into jet lag. I hope I'm not completely taken over by it at the end of the day. Anyway, please bear with me if I sound to be boring while reading. Reading, of course, is very important, but it also has some authoritative function to perform. So I don't actually read. So anyway, before I read, I should make one or two preliminary remarks. One is that why are we actually approaching this particular theme when you are actually celebrating the unfinished legacy of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar? And at what level do you really want to pitch up your discussion of studying race or studying caste? So you have a very, very moving narratives by Isabella, and we have several very moving, disturbing narratives of caste back in India and also in the US. That's one way, one level of actually putting across your views on caste and narrativizing your own experience, and which is the basis for doing something reflective on caste or race. Therefore, there are three levels one understands these two phenomena in the US and in India. One is being politically correct. This for the young scholars in the hall. Now, in the age of Facebook and social media, politically being correct is very, very prominent. It's a very little investment in that. And people in India wait, when is your petition coming? I want to sign it. So actually you go into trivializing the whole issue. The politically correct has become very, very, it has gained a big purchase. So I'm not too comfortable with this being politically correct. It is some kind of a very, it's a protocol question for the radicals. So one level is being politically correct, and the other level is being politically conscious. And so there is a qualitative difference between being politically correct and being politically conscious. Politically conscious, you need to intervene, stand by. Okay? Intervention is at the core in being politically conscious. But the third level is very important, I think, for the young scholars. I'm also young. Being theoretically conscious. And that is the level at where one has to pitch, because the discourse on race and caste has traveled so much that you just can't really be repetitive about the same thing. And that's the plea, that's the consideration at this point in time. So I will reflect on something which might look to be very, very idiosyncratic or very confusing. Please bear with me. Level 3, this is an archaeology of presentation. Level 3, ordinary theory of inequality is the title of my talk. So let me begin this talk with two sets of discomforting questions. First, do we need to approach the question of caste and race, particularly of social inequality, independent of equality? Can we think about equality without considering without any reference to equality as an extraordinary discourse, extraordinary theory? And race is an extraordinary, even equality question is also, theory of equality is also extraordinary. Does Indian social reality offer us an epistemological promise to fashion out a theory of social inequality without any reference to methodological protocols that will help organizing, validating general theory of inequality? Why would one want to start with the word inequality as a reference point at all? Is it a matter of discursive choice, or is it a matter of free will, mukta chanda in poetry? Free will to do theory, or to theory of inequality. This question becomes important in the context where social inequality, both in the US and India, in all its incarnation, both theoretical and political, through different times has either been considered as the negative starting point. If you start with race or caste, it is considered to be a negative reference point. So it has to be avoided. Either considered as the negative starting point or unavoidable evil, and hence could be addressed only at the rhetorical and not even theoretical level. We all remember Habermas actually sought to deal with this question of guilt by doing theory. So theory is an escape route. It was a very, very sophisticated way of really getting rid of your guilt by writing books on. So this is the context with which we have to actually raise this point. And we have debates in late 19th century and early 20th century that the nationalists and other scholars never wanted you to talk about caste because it is embarrassing. Even today you find that. So I don't know what will happen to me when I go back, but it doesn't matter. So this is unavoidable evil. So for these two reasons, we need to talk about inequality and take it a starting point. Now, thus the central and methodological concern of this presentation is basically how to approach the question of inequality in general and social, race and caste-based graded inequality in particular. Graded inequality is the word given by Babasaheb Ambedkar, and there has to be some discussion on this. And I am going to deal with this word graded inequality in my presentation. This is the first set of questions. The second set of questions about, which is an extension of the first, what is the theoretical advantage that one can gain by starting discussion with graded inequality? Does a study of graded inequality as a starting point offer us any adequate and convincing understanding, or does it really offer a very tantalizing or tragic standpoint? I'm also trying to make a distinction between what is starting point and what is standpoint. And we have no time to explain, but I'm just leaving the idea with you, just to differentiate. We can come back to this in the question answer session if it's a time. So, as a corollary to this first question, let me raise a couple of additional questions. Does inequality as a starting point have either limiting or expansive impact on the very nature of its theoretical expression? Does it limit your expression or does it expand? So that's the question. When you start with the negative point, as racial inequality or caste inequality. If yes, what could be the nature of the conceptual language that it will summon to its command in order to realize its theoretical potentials? Normally we start with equality, but our challenge, if it is a solidarity question, how do you start? What should be your starting point? Your point has to be negative or excluded concept like inequality or race or caste, and what could be the conceptual language that you would command to your, you would summon to your command to realize the theoretical potential. What could be the nature and content of this conceptual language? Now you have to use your, I think I have to read this book again. So what is the conceptual language that is there in this caste studies and race studies? There is a distinct language. The language has to be, in terms of its content and mood and spirit, negative. It cannot be positive. If it is positive, actually it is a blasphemy. So, and this is a very strong word I'm using, but that's it. It is a negative, it is negative, which it is going to be. Will the grotesque meaning lead to the reification of this very conceptual language into its permanent negativity? You don't have, it is then reified into negativity, you don't have to touch it, it's just gone out of your circulation. Is it an obsession to look at social reality with exclusionary concepts such as graded inequality or racial inequality? If yes, is this negativity self-defeating? Do you have only negative language? How do you actually achieve this common humanity she was referring to? If that is your goal, to really reach common humanity, which will actually include both white and black and upper caste and lower caste, so what should be your transcending move? You have to walk out from this negative into positive. As Baba Saheb Ambedkar actually started with negative and moved into positive Buddhism. So that's the trajectory. Will it have affirmative promise to become a mode of expression and motivation as well, the negative? Does the language of Bahishkut Bharat, the ostracized India, Bahishkut Bharat in Ambedkar, graduate itself into Puraskut Bharat, Prabuddha Bharat? That's the journey. Prabuddha Bharat is a Buddhist term. And Gary, you must have, in your art work, it is already there. To put it yet differently, will the theory of social inequality acquire a particular character and thus cater to the emancipatory needs only of blacks? I'm just using this word, I don't know. I mean, Afro-American is the right word, and I think this is a genealogy to this word. It is actually moved into different expressions radically. So, will it actually cater to the emancipatory concerns only of the Dalits or only of the blacks? So, and the answer is no. It will not really. It will not stuck to this particularity, but it will have to become universality itself, merging itself into common humanity. So, what role does inequality play in terms of unfolding to us inner normative content of this standpoint? So, Dalit standpoint, feminist standpoint, black standpoint has to be normative in at its core. It cannot be actually reified, negative, pathological standpoint. It has to be, so the appeal is to move out of this identity into become a larger human identity. These questions become important in terms of working out not only Dalit or Afro-American solidarity, but also critically revisiting the question of standpoint epistemology. I am already referring to the limits of standpoint epistemology. We had debate with Sharmila, like a very esteemed friend of ours, who is no more now, but so there was a debate in India about what is standpoint epistemology and how enabling it is. So reference to that. These are two sets of questions that I will try and address in the same sequence in which they are posed in the current presentation. Let's start with the first set. Why should we discuss? Why should the discussion start with inequality? That's the point. Starting with inequality as a reference point offers us three distinct advantages. First, Since the affirmative language of equality or ideal theory of equality tends to be premised over assumption or intuition that, and what is the assumption? When Professor John Rawls was doing his theory of justice, he assumed injustice in American system. So the assumption that all forms of inequality are same, race, caste, all, that is the assumption. It is by its very methodological need, therefore, tends to avoid assigning substantive theoretical treatment to social inequality as lived reality, as it is there in the book. So assumption is not adequate enough to really give a full treatment to this word called inequality. So you have to actually unfold to us what are the layers of inequality, and for that you require a different standpoint, a starting point. In such grand theorization of equality, words get filled with possible meaning. I would submit to your consideration, please concentrate on what is this finished, the words get filled with possible meaning. Meaning is possible. It is not yielded it is just possible. Because equality is possible, justice is possible. So there is a possibility of meaning in the word social justice or equality. So words get filled with possible meaning, while the actual meaning is just assumed in such words. Actual meaning that your caste region, race region mentality, that's actual, but it is assumed. It's not actually properly theoretically fleshed out. So there is an ill treatment given to the word inequality. To put differently, inequality is assumed to be present in the very conceptualization of equality. Grand theory of equality fails to be more attentive to the particular needs of these two, race and caste. And individual experience, as it is narrative-wise, is not, it doesn't give any intense feeling of your problem. So there is problem there. And therefore we find that this ideal theory of equality is just inadequate to capture the depth of our experience. However, one must find some degree of truthfulness in such grand theorization. Professor Rawls and others, as theorists do acknowledge the existence of inequality, though treating inequality as one of the illustrations of negative reality. They think that there is a caste problem, there is a race problem, but we can actually subsume that particular problem into generality of ideal theory of justice and caste. So such assumptions, however, tend to underplay the possibility of inequality becoming independent reference point, independent of equality. And as they say in philosophical debates, the tautological character of this theory thus involves an epistemic injustice to inequality as a social need. So theory becomes a social need. Theory of inequality becomes a social need for Afro-American and Dalits. You just can't send it on holidays. You can't defer it. Yeah. So that's my plea. I've been doing it, and I don't know. I hope they take me seriously. It's a matter of injustice. It is a matter of epistemic injustice, as in the grand theorization of equality, inequality receives unfair discursive treatment. In theory of equalities, the fondest hope of theory of equality is to become ideal. But it becomes ideal only assuming inequality. And that is the problem with grand theorization. What it does, it is actually, grand theory actually separates the lived experience from its existence. Existence of caste in the book, and several books, is there with actual meaning. But this existence, the lived experience actually is separated from this existence. There is a separation that is achieved. Whereas theory of inequality will start from existence to become, to give a reflection or to give an abstraction to lived experience. That's the function of theory of inequality, ordinary theory of inequality. The concepts that holds this theory together, the concepts that hold this theory of inequality together would get filled with thick meaning, derived from the incarcerated, stigmatized experiences of communities in India and in the US. And therefore, so you need to have this ordinary theory of inequality. Theory of social inequality will have to be therefore necessarily follow the anthropological route. Fine. So I'm just not there, but anyway, I'll just cover only one point now. Reading from Murli's work on Madhya Pradesh, and I was talking to him, anthropology is a great resource to really puncture the confidence of all general universal theories. In the moment somebody makes a valid claims a universal validity of theory, anthropology will come and puncture that. So you need to actually have anthropological root to really fish out the thick language, thick meaning of race and caste, and that should form the basis of your theorization. Jyotirao Phule and Babasaheb Ambedkar, in their efforts to conceptualize social inequality, followed precisely this anthropological route. And Anand, there are many. I mean, do we have Ambedkar as anthropologists? We have. Why did they follow this route? This was possibly because they had the grand plan to make anti-caste discourse not only politically more effective, but ultimately socially more transformative than the contending discourses that existed during the nationalist discourse in 19th century and early 20th century. This is the first advantage you get, and I have only 5 minutes now that I can just discuss second advantage. I have 2 more advantages, but we can just forget about them. We need to start, second advantage, we need to start from the standpoint of social inequality. This will help us to evaluate the moral caliber of grand theory. Give me a little time. I think, what should I do? I'll just skip the second point, and I also skip the third point, and I'll just come on to the final point. Do we have time? No. Many important, but final point. Let's see. I'm skipping so much. I'm feeling very sad about it, painful. Starting with graded inequality, for example, as a theoretical point, this graded inequality, which is mirrored with incarceration, would offer us much needed evaluative standpoint. The standpoint is not simply descriptive but evaluative. That could be used to introduce some kind of order in moral concepts such as fairness and respect. This is the crucial point I thought I'll just complete. Incarcerated inequality as a starting point would motivate us to put the principle of fairness before moral goods such as self-respect. And there is an order in these 2 words. Putting fairness before self-respect acquires enormous significance in the context where the Dalits and the poor Afro-American find themselves generation after generation in the same obnoxious war reference was made that has deep incarcerating impact on their moral integrity as a human being. Put differently, one could ask the Dalits and Afro-American the question such as, is it fair for them to stay in the same obnoxious war? That's the idea of the self. You can really attack me, please attack me. Obnoxious work, this question. The work that inflicts continuous stigma at them. even though they are actually out of that particular context. Valmiki woman, actually, after having finished her own work, a scented body, and she is fine, she is not allowed to participate in the economy. Capitalism in our country has so many problems. So I think there was a full section on that, and I'm skipping that as well. So the concept of fairness to self is not the agency question. So much of Foucault Maharaj and others, so agency questions, we have two Maharaj, one is Foucault Maharaj, the other one is Manu Maharaj. Agency question, but a structural question. Being unfair to oneself is not the function of autonomous will, or the matter of, how many minutes? 1 minute, 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
It's not a matter of 2 minutes, good. So in fact, being unfair to oneself is the result of one is result of the systematic entrapment of the African American and the Dalits into this obnoxious world. So it's not the agency question, it's a very structure. You are actually pushed into it regularly. However, emancipatory claims that capitalism makes in different stages, even in neoliberal, but the situation of the African American is not different from the previous times. So you have scavenging and rat picking and other things in India. So people are, generation after generation, Dalits have been there in that particular. And Sushruth, you were mentioning about the dumping grounds in Mumbai. There are people who are there in that dumping ground for generations after generations. There is no outward mobility. So that's the, why do they stay there is the question of fairness. Why they are unfair to themselves? Is it their will question, or they have chosen to be there? No, it's the structural question. They have no option because of kind of very skewed development and capitalism. That's the question that why is one unfair to oneself acquires priority over the question of becoming a self-respecting person. So the self-respecting person comes later. In understanding the logic of inequality, one needs to necessarily start from the specific context of the law of self-exploitation. Why they exploit themselves? The Marxian idea of self-exploitation. For example, Dalits getting into manholes in India, rather than from the universal principle of self-respect. This is not to suggest that self-respect is dispensable. In fact, it is the essential condition of the normative constitution of the self. Self-respect, in fact, is the essential condition of the non-normative constitution of the self. But that is actually that is denied because of the law of self-exploitation. In order for us to reach this goal, we need to walk out of the trap of graded inequality and perhaps take a next step and demand what could we term as affirmative inequality as an enabling condition. I'm just saying affirmative inequality. Baba Ambedkar's graded inequality is premised over affirmative inequality. So what is the theoretical basis of this affirmative inequality? We have to reflect on that. I think I will stop here. Stop with inviting you to study more and more on graded inequality in Baba Ambedkar's Annihilation of the Past. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
She's showing something. She's showing something, so we can see in the. We can see it. Yeah. Can see it here. Is somebody sitting?
You are.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I disagree with one thing. If you go back and you have trouble, that is not something that's not important. It's very important.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me at the back? Right, great, thank you. We've had such wonderful speakers before me, and I feel totally inadequate to follow the app, but I hope you will forgive me if I don't come up to your expectations. I've been given such a wonderful introduction. I really don't think I deserve everything that's been said before, but here we go. I try to do what I can as best as I can, and like everybody else, fail occasionally, and I hope to succeed in the things that matter And the things that matter to me right now are making sure somehow that we manage to get into the Equality Act in UK, the inclusion of caste, and to prevent caste discrimination if possible. I'll mention that in due course. So 2 years ago, in your country, a black philosopher, George Yancey of Emory University, wrote an opinion piece in New York Times, which urged his readers to examine their complicity with racism. And last week, in the Chronicle of Higher Education, he recounted the traumatic racist ritual he faced then and more. He tells us about standing in front of his class and reading the racist letter he received in November 2017 from a white person enraged by his op-ed piece. He broke down in front of his class in anger, commenting on his return to the class, which he thinks now has changed forever. He writes of his graduate students, "They bore witness to my vulnerability, my suffering." I recognize the racist ritual, the appeal to false victimhood. The context for me is Britain, and I am talking about race, about caste. I'm called upon to bear witness to the vulnerability of those who suffer from caste discrimination. I realize that we cannot take anything for granted in our understanding of caste as a theoretical concept. That caste, what caste means, continues to be contested. However, challenges to the meaning of caste are not always made with the fair intentions to seek clarity. Sometimes these challenges to the meaning of caste are made to deny the wounds that result from assertions of caste superiority. Challengers in the UK have, over the last decade, stopped up their operations to distract the government from fulfilling its statutory duty to institute legal protection for sufferers of caste discrimination. They want the world to believe that caste divisions in the UK are merely constructs, not really there. They also want people to think of caste divisions as benign and harmless. Indeed, some folk go so far as to declare caste divisions as welcome sources of solidarity. When confronted with undeniable evidence of caste divisions being used to discriminate, these deniers say it is not caste per se which is to be blamed, but some individuals' abuse of a position within a benign social system. In contrast, the victims of caste discrimination point a finger at the very existence of caste divisions, which are policed in multifarious ways. It is part of the denier's argument that caste is not central to their identity, although the role it has often played or is often considered as valuable because ritual matters of life, death, and progeny are tied to it. On the other hand, for the victims of discrimination, as the Dalit Solidarity Network report of 2006 from the UK so neatly put in its title, there is no escape. That's the name of the report, No Escape. Once marked and with no escape, a victim might then choose to use caste as a standpoint. I will say starting point as well, I agree with you about, as a standpoint from which to voice protest and seek solidarity. I will return in the end to the question of how one might form productive and not corrosive bonds of solidarity. Here I initially suggest that togetherness is firstly about connectedness to others, and secondly, but not always equally, it is about acceptance. Our acceptance by others and their acceptance of us. It is worth noting that one can remain connected to others who do not accept one as we may want them to, and sometimes these are the most pernicious kinds of togetherness and belonging. But connectedness is not solidarity. Social caste society, after all, offers habitual allegiances, and some allegiances have to be challenged. Dr. Ambedkar argued that habitual conduct with the backing of religion is not easy to change, and that salvation will come only if the caste Hindu is made to think and is forced to feel that he must alter his ways. We need to think through the means of defiance against systemic oppression and stigmatization of people on the basis of caste. So my aim is to challenge those who misrepresent the existence of caste discrimination in the UK and to further the proposal to introduce legislation to outlaw it. From September 2013 to February 2014, I led a project on caste in Britain for the UK Equality and Human Rights Commission, which culminated in 2 research reports. These are available online from the Equality and Human Rights Commission website. The remit of the project was firstly to review existing social legal research on caste and British equality law, and second, to conduct 2 supporting events with the aim of bringing together interdisciplinary expertise and a range of stakeholder views on caste and discrimination on the basis of caste in the UK. In April 2013, MPs and peers had voted in both houses of Parliament to enact the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Bill, Section 97 of which requires government to introduce a statutory prohibition of caste discrimination into British equality law by making caste an aspect of the protected characteristic of race in the Equality Act 2010. Following direction by the government, the EHRC contracted me to lead a team of academics from different universities to carry out an independent study on caste in Britain. We set out to identify concerns and common ground in relation to the implementation of the statutory prohibition on caste discrimination in advance of and in anticipation of the required secondary legislation that will make caste an aspect of race in the Equality Act 2010. This still hasn't been done. The secondary legislation required a public consultation, which ran from March to September 2017. The government decision to consult the public followed intense lobbying by opposing sides. The pro-legislation groups drawn from many different communities across the country have demanded that government must follow the direction of Parliament given in April 2013. These were the people who were campaigning then and now. That ministers must make caste an aspect of race. On the other side, for several years, community groups have spoken against legislation on caste discrimination. So 2 months after the close of the consultation, the Minister for Equalities in the present Conservative government, Nick Gibb, reported to the House of Commons on 23rd November 2017 that they received 13,000 responses. This is extraordinary by way of a public response to a change in law. Comparable responses have been very few. From his party, the MP for Harrow East, Bob Blackman, relayed the reported view of British Hindus, I quote, that having caste as a protected characteristic in equality law is unnecessary and divisive, and urged his right honourable friend to take action to remove the provision which was introduced by the Labour Party from the legislative book. The reports from my EHRC project, which formed a key reference to the GEO's public consultation, were hard work to produce. Collecting stakeholder views was quite challenging due to the range of opinions and heightened sensitivities of both the pro-legislation and anti-legislation organizations, which were brought face to face in a day-long workshop on 9th November 2013. We had to generate an environment of sustained exchange of views between very diverse opinions, from the extreme right wing to the extreme left wing, and interspersed with perspectives of a medley of some very seasoned and other rather new campaigners, not versed in any definitive political tendency, but pragmatically open to any party that supported their particular pro or anti-legislation stance. Now, in this case, we were not forging solidarities, but we were seeking common ground. And the minimum that we wanted was a sufficient ground to agree that caste needed to be addressed by the law. To the stakeholders, that representing about 43 different organizations, we presented our considered view on how caste must be addressed in the equality life, and in the ensuing discussion, we were quite open to suggestions and modulations. Looking back now, from the vantage point of the recently concluded public consultation, which received these 13,000 responses yet to be analyzed, it is hard to recall the feeling of satisfaction that we then had. At the end of that stakeholder event, we were very pleased that people had come to some understanding that there is, after all, a problem to be addressed, and there is a need for the law to do something. But with the gap that has happened from then to now, positions have actually hardened, and I am quite pessimistic about what's going to happen now. So opinions on opposing sides have actually hardened, and proponents and opponents of the legislation prepared their own guidance notes to influence the public response to the consultation. There was a website from one side and another from the other side. So the anti-legislation lobby, constituted by several Hindu organizations, used this line of reasoning. Firstly, that caste is an outdated concept. Both the routes to legislation suggested by the government, that is either adding caste to the Equality Act or using case law. If you're interested, we'll be having a workshop on the third day, and all the details of how this has happened and what it actually means, I'm going to take it up again. But for now, take it. There were two options the government offered, and the Hindu lobby rejected both those options. And the reasoning is that, most intriguingly, they argued that this lobby suggests that talking about caste discrimination is discriminatory and prejudicial towards Hindus, opening the Hindu community to unfair litigation based on someone else's interpretation of caste. So they say caste is described in this guidance as a colonial Christian concept, a hate word, a pejorative expression, and it is said if the word enters statute as legislation, it will legitimate the denigration of Indians, especially Hindus, Sikhs, and Jains. So in summing up their arguments, this side throws in an ambiguous reasons for opposing the legislation. Namely, we do not want the social misgivings of caste from India to enter the consciousness of communities in the UK. It is divisive and creates inter-community tensions that would not otherwise exist. This legislation will create caste consciousness amongst future generations of British Hindus, resurfacing old wounds from another country. They offer as an alternative to legislation the solution of, and this is so familiar from here to you, I guess, education and a retelling of India's cultural and colonial history. In order, I quote, to erase and remove the colonially proliferated, missionary-fueled, anti-dharmic concept of caste from all communities, quote close. In what appears to me a startling own goal, they listed at the cost of the legislation this reasoning, I quote, we have witnessed the break of previously healthy personal relations amongst our youngsters by the harmful introduction of the caste concept into their personal and commercial relationships. So I say, so the legislation is a powerful tool, isn't it? But I ask, could personal relations have been healthy if they were marred by a concept? There is a more telling hint how breaks and divisions might happen in the closing words of this anti-legislation community guidance. So this is what they say. The consequences will be deep, divisive, and long-term, and all concerned, including those who may receive some notional protection from the law, but who will become pariahs in their own communities, as they are avoided by all communities for fear of some unclear transgression or offense being innocently committed and incorrectly perceived. Now, if this isn't a veiled threat, what is? The viciousness of using the terms pariah and avoided is an unmistakable and twisted reminder of untouchability and a threat of ostracism to those who are spearheading the demand for legislation. This guidance is a rather extreme response to the prospect of legislation, but milder forms of objections have preceded such responses from highly respected but unexpected quarters. These other objectors to the legislation also begin by signaling the complexity of caste. So in the debate on 22nd April 2013 in the House of Lords that finally led to the Parliament's direction that ministers must make caste an aspect of race, Lord Bhikhu Parekh was opposing the amendment to include caste, argued, talking about abolishing the caste system is extremely problematic because it could mean getting rid of the category, getting rid of the hierarchy amongst the category, or getting rid of the principle of heredity which determines caste. Where do you start? I suggest that caste as a category of discrimination is therefore not in the same league as race, religion, or any other of the protected characteristics. hold close. He conceded that untouchability exists in the UK in small pockets, but concluded that, quote, the point is that it is only one extreme form of caste. By introducing caste as a general category in this way, one is trying to catch too much and will end up catching too little, close close. I have responded to Lord Parek's arguments in detail, and this is for your reference in an article in Radical Philosophy in 2015. One of my arguments is to question Parek's claim that once you take away untouchability, there is no evidence of any kind to show that caste discrimination takes place. On the contrary, I argue there is sufficient evidence of discrimination to warrant inclusion of caste in the Equality Act, as our research shows, and before ours, a number of community reports have shown. In my individual research projects prior to the HRC Commission report, I had found through qualitative interviews that there are generational differences in the experience and acknowledgement of caste prejudice. The younger generation does not identify with the caste system as a hierarchical system. They believe caste discrimination exists, but they are confident in facing prejudices, naming it, and associate discrimination with those who perpetuate it. They expect the law to be used to combat such discrimination. I also found that while intercaste marriages between Dalit and non-Dalits do take place in the UK, deep-seated caste prejudice persists, and in some cases, clinging on to such deep-seated ignorance ruins and even takes lives. As one ill-fated young man wrote to me in 2011 in a letter that shockingly turned out to be a suicide note. Within 24 hours of writing to me, he had committed suicide. In general, I found that relatively speaking, the improved economic status of Dalits in the UK is not matched by the expected change in their reception within social circles of the so-called upper caste, thereby reinforcing a sense of separateness based on caste. Several cases of discrimination and obvious cases of harassment can also occur due to tensions generated by such segregation. In a pilot study on religious conversion, the phrases people use to describe their experience of caste prejudice include, I quote, "it sticks." Another, "people are set in their ways." The hold of caste on people's mind is something we have, they say, to break. It was clear that for Dalits in the UK, perceived low caste status is one of the motivating factors for religious conversion or religious separation, for example, between Ravidasiyas and Sikh, and they desire respect and dignity to result from it. Now, Lord Parek had also asked, how do you define caste, implying correctly that this is no easy undertaking. But I argue it is not necessary to have a definition of caste as such for the purposes of legislation. Indeed, race is left undefined in the Equality Act 2010. Finally, Parek claims that a category as indeterminate as that of caste does not deserve to be enshrined in domestic legislation. My response is that all we need to identify caste discrimination is the ability to identify patterns of behavior that would reasonably be seen as discrimination on the basis of caste by the victims of the discrimination. What matters is not the meaning of the term caste, but the identification of those patterns of discrimination that can be called casteist. Reflecting upon what I have heard over the years from the opponents and supporters of the legislation, my hypothesis is that the experience of racism shapes people differently depending upon their location in the matrix of available collective hypocrisies. And this is a term I use from Emile Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism. The person belonging to the so-called upper caste is able to say, in comparison with the humiliation that I have experienced at the hands of the racist, I am not a casteist. So the upper caste people who came to Britain in the 50s, 60s and have suffered racism, when they compare it with that, they don't think that they are casteist. Their casteism is of a different kind. And because they have been victimized in one way, and I compare this to the ritual of the white person who's accused of racism, which I started with right in the beginning. There's a sense of appropriating victimhood in a way which denies their own role in being casteist or being racist. So there is a discontinuity in the experience that allows the collective hypocrisy of caste is benign to take hold. A political stand that substitutes genuine bonds of solidarity, presenting what is driven by, to use his term, appetite and force, as if it were guided by a concern for the other. For the Dalit, on the other hand, there is a continuity of experience of humiliation, and hence an insistence that racism and casteism are similar, as my respondents put it. So the backdrop of racism, against which claims of casteism are experientially registered, is an inescapable predicament of the diaspora. This backdrop has the paradoxical potential to generate solidarities with the oppressed, as well as routes to evasion of responsibility. So one is complicit one way or another. All inaction is still action. However, I think we need to think a bit more about being with others, especially in non-argumentative modes. To do this, we must change our direction of thinking to grapple with the unthought. Not in the banal sense of that which has not yet been thought, but that which is beyond the discursive realm. So I've started to think about counter-rituals, modes of protest which enacts a politics of viscerality. To use Achille Mbembe's term, it's a phrase from his talk, Franz Fanon and the Politics of Viscerality. They are what he would call strategies of disruption. Those who are willing to take part in the disruptions that I engage in are more solidly on my side. We belong together. We feel pain together. We laugh together. It is not how our body appears to others that seals our togetherness. Such togetherness is merely a seriality, to use your Persat's term in Critique of Dialectical Reason. Just I happen to be the same color as you, or I happen to be of the same gender. That itself is not togetherness. And it is easily ruptured. Mbembe says, to see is no longer enough. I don't know what I'm seeing. You might be wearing a mask. If I cannot trust the face I see, how do I make sure you are with me? So looking alike is no ground for solidarity. Doing things together can seal our togetherness. To be able to turn a relation of seriality between people into an active relation between group members through shared projects, that I think is at the heart of the politics of solidarity. That may require disrupting habitual allegiances that caste society offers. It is by no means an easy task, but it is not impossible. And I expect the conversations in the next 2 days will show us some ways we can try to create such bonds of solidarity. Thank you.
So first, let's thank our three speakers again for their great story. And we have some time for questions, responses, comments, or thoughts. If anyone in the audience would like to start, and if you don't mind, if you would introduce yourself. And then there's a microphone. I'm sorry, I forgot the most important part.
Thank you, everybody. Excellent session. Isabel, I should appreciate you for laying out some of the bullet pointers, very easy pointers for us to go and kind of build the solidarity. And I also, the question of race and caste also comes within this imperial baggage that we carry. It's again a reinterpretation or misinterpretation of white man or Europe colonial modernity. So race doesn't fit, so does caste, because caste is again a construct. So I'm still grappling. I understand this shared solidarities and experiences, but is there a possibility of creating a new jargon? Something that could, or that doesn't mean, subsiding other cultural variants that exist. Because I will just offer one quick comment. Professor Guru, you said, talked about agency and structure, and then you kind of put the debate into structure. But there are some people who still say that caste is still a matter of agency because people are still carrying that in this kind of psychological carriers, and so you need to talk to yourself. So this is a debate. So when you are engaging with structure, I'm not sure how are we to grapple with this question, because still it is abstract for me. Can we really solidify? Because Meena is saying caste could be qualified as race in the equality bill. So I see a sort of contradictions within the aspects of what you three said, and this interesting contradiction and something that could give us new. So I'm just putting that out.
Thank you. Why don't we do that? Why don't we take a few questions in the interest of time? Take a few questions, and then you can all just take your turn responding to them.
My name is Richard Frasca, and my focus is on Tamil studies from South India and Dalit issues and literature in that part of India. And I wanted to thank Isabel for writing such an excellent book. And but it was very interesting. You used a very interesting term. You said inheritances. So that word indicates to me that you understand what happened in your book as being an inheritance of slavery. And we're trying to establish a solidarity here. One of the issues for me, and I've been at academic conferences where people have made these statements declaratively, one of which was at Harvard. It was a South Asia conference, and I have heard scholars, and they were not, people did not argue with them, say there was never slavery in India. And I know in the Tamil language, the word for slavery is adime, and that's not used when people talk about caste. It's another term, tindame, which means untouchability, tite. Most frequently, they will use jadi, which is also a Tamil word to refer to caste. So I think it's very important to focus on the history of slavery in India. I don't buy the argument or the statement that there was never slavery in India, number one. So I think it's very important for someone to do some historical research on slavery in India. And secondly, again in Hindi, the word slave is dasa. And again, I don't think they use that terminology in terms of political rhetoric in India regarding the caste issue. So there seems to be some cultural, conceptual issues here that we need to deal with.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to cut you over. So do you have a final thought?
Yeah, so I mean, I came away with a simple question based on Isabel's statement about inheritances. What is caste an inheritance of? And that sounds like a very simplistic question, but I think if we're making this solidarity between race and caste, then we do have to talk about inheritances.
Thank you. I saw, there we are. Sure, I think, can we
Sure.
Thank you. My name is Gautam Desai, and my question is regarding the electoral politics in India and politics of viscerality and solidarity. Arguably, caste has become at least the rallying point and at least the electoral micro-targeting, and thereby reconfiguring into majorities. The class, I don't know whether it has failed or it has been inadequate in generating the solidarities in the liberal democracy. So my question is, on one hand, it almost seems to me that the politics of viscerality seems to be a reaction, but that seems to be politics of solidarity of whether it's white race or upper caste in India, and they are trying to preserve the privileges that they have versus the invaders at the gate who are using the democratic processes to get their fair share. But on the other hand, caste has or race has been just a reactive, tentative way of sticking together because we are similar or we have some similar inheritances, but whether it has really become alternative site of solidarity or it is kind of subsuming class and caste in the context of electoral politics. So that's the kind of area that I'm interested in knowing.
Christine, I was so struck by the introduction of certainly the drinking fountain issue, but also the issue of the Jim Crow Bible in Isabel's talk, because at the very beginning of Dr. Ambedkar's career, of course, he led this march to gain access to decent drinking water in the city of Mahad. And of course, he and his followers were beaten terribly by the police and arrested and so on. But a day or so later, they burned the Bible of untouchability, which is the book of Manu, which has all the rules of the horrible things that would happen to people if they stepped out of line, having, molten lead poured in their ears if they even heard a Sanskrit word and things of that nature. So this Bible was burned at the beginning, but at the end of his career, he wrote a Bible of his own, which was the story of the Buddha and his teachings, which he hoped would be inspirational for those who wanted to liberate themselves from this caste system.
So why don't we turn to our three panelists?
Thank you, Suraj, and just a very pointed question. So what is the relationship between agency and structure? That has been a very methodologically problematic issue that people, scholars have been discussing. Am I audible there? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. The point is this, when we say agency is important, because to make structures speak, articulate, you require agency. Structures don't speak by themselves. They require agency, And that's why the whole linguistic theory that you require communication and to make the structures speak. Structures of exploitation, class exploitation, caste exploitation. And so agency is the very important element in terms of really making structure speak. And the effect of a structure is actually communicated through agency. And so that's one point. The other point, sometimes agency is not infinitely attached to structures. Agencies actually also enjoy some kind of autonomy. And the post-structural term is more on this autonomy rather than the structuredness of the agency. To give a very simple example, there was a reference to Manusmriti. So, of course, Ambedkar never considered Buddhism as Bible. It's a collective production of many people. So he never actually won any, he of course he visualized, but there's some collective effort gone into making it a possibility. But that's an interesting point. Agencies enjoy autonomy, and when they enjoy it, when the caste people enjoy autonomy in terms of England or in terms of anywhere, they are not supposed to actually take the brief from Manusmriti. Oh, okay, now I want to read, I'm actually committing atrocities against you, reading page number 10 in that. They don't do that.
With agency as an individual or collective?
Of course, it is individual of some type, it is collective as well. Agency individually is existential problem, so it is defeating. It doesn't take you. It goes to heroicness or anything. Collective agency. That's the point. So they don't really normally quote authority of structures, but they still act. Now, caste, atrocities and violence is not always referred to the pages in Manusmriti. So they enjoy, but that doesn't mean that they are free from structures. Now, there is no caste in India. Is an aberration of being this collective hypocrisy. Yeah. So you just you just resolve the question of caste at the level of psychology. That's it. Is it the question of psychology to be resolved either through theory or psychological satisfaction? So that's the point. So there are 2 points actually. So I think this is the more, should we really go into this post-structural agential, or you should always focus on how do you understand people in America and people in India find themselves all the time in all these undesirable, defiling, the stigmatized occupations. And even in neoliberal times, they say now the utopia is very negative. They actually are fighting to tighten their control on obnoxious occupations. They don't want others to walk into that. So this is something really horrible, to say the least. So there are agency as an individual existential thing has a different root. It doesn't yield any collective action, no solidarity, no configuration, but the agency has to become collective. And then it becomes collective only through ideological motivations, political mobilization, and there's a theory of articulation of agency anyway. So we'll have chat on another occasion. Thank you.
Professor Dante, do you want to?
You want me
Yeah.
to?
I think you could just go ahead.
Okay.
Is there things that you would like to respond to or introduce
Right,
to the
yes.
conversation?
I think there was one particular one about the politics of viscerality, which you mentioned. Okay, so my point was really that from the point of view of those who are challenging casteism, that we need to pay attention to this from what we can do. Okay, of course, it is routinely used by those who are on the other side, say on the other side. It's routinely used. It's a well understood mechanism of motivating people to do all kinds of things which are unreasoned. But I think that we really also need to think about this area of life, which is not about reasoning, it is not about taking stands, it is not about discussing and coming to an agreement, but it's about making habits of responding to things. So, and that can be done, I think, regardless of other divisions like gender, caste, etc. Two people of completely with different color, different gender, whatever, might respond to the same thing in the same way if they have done things together so that their responses are in tune. So I'm saying we really need to think in terms of developing ways, whether it's through counter rituals is one of the things I'm saying, even celebratory things, even festivals, whatever. Yeah, we have to think of ways in which beyond what we think and talk about, our bodies respond in the same way to things. So it's about training our bodies. This is what I'm saying, really. So I don't have any answers about what kind of things. It depends upon your location, where you are. Maybe theater in some place does the job. Maybe in some other place something else will do the job. But I'm thinking about what sort of things we can do. This is not about any big theory at all, but except for the fact that I think it's a misunderstanding to focus on human agency only as a choosing being. I don't think that is correct. Human beings do not consciously choose. They do things and maybe sometimes retrospectively justify what they do as choices. But what they do is what we need to focus. How can people be made to do things? Okay, so sorry, I'm being a bit vague and abstract, but thank you.
I wanted to respond to several of them. I'm going to just go in order that I've written down. One has to do with inheritability being one of the central aspects of caste. I'm thinking of inheritability of the characteristics that then hold you in a stigmatized place. And for African Americans, of course, the additional burden is the visibility of the stigmatization, which can be life-threatening, as we've seen in recent weeks and years. Which means that there's a kind of being saddled with the consequences of the inherited status, which I think is one of the things that distinguishes us from when we talk about race. I think of it as caste, because caste shows the rigidity of that stigmatization, that very little, it seems, that you can do to protect yourself if you happen to be, as Amadou Diallo was, walking down the stairway of his apartment, and he happened to have a cell phone with him, and the police thought it was a gun, and they shot him 41 times. There's no protection. It didn't matter what he was doing. It didn't matter what class he was. It didn't matter what education he had. It didn't matter what a good person he was. It didn't matter that he was unarmed. There's no protection against a caste assumption that this individual is at the bottom of the hierarchy. Anything can be done to that person. There will be no consequences for what you do, which is the case for so many of these instances. There's very little empathy. And one of the things that I often mention when we see the videos of these police shootings, is that the initial justification for this violence is that the officer says that he felt threatened, he feared for his life. But what's interesting is what happens after the person is down. We saw this with Tamir Rice. We saw this with John Crawford in Ohio. We've seen this with all these cases, Philando Castile, where once the person is down, there is the human instinct to help and protect a person who has been shot is not there. There's not the effort to help that person once that person is already down. And so that's what I mean by it's more than just, I don't like people who look like this, or I feel uncomfortable around people who look like this. There's a rigidity and a dehumanization of the individual based upon what they look like. And it's that rigidity and that automatic response to knowing that you can do anything to these people and nothing will happen. That's what I mean by the idea that racism alone does not seem to me to capture the magnitude and the complexity of what's going on in that moment. Secondly, I think a lot of times people will say, well, why do people do the things that they do? Why did these people do a particular thing? And my answer is always, there's only one response to that, and that is, why do human beings do when they're in a particular position? So, or a particular circumstance. So in the case of these two societies, India, a much older society, the United States, a much younger society, but one in which things have happened very rapidly to rise from being a colonial space to being a world power in a matter of centuries. The question to me is, what's interesting to me is how the upper castes in both societies have had a similar response to similar circumstances. So in the current situation is that both systems are under pressure as the lowest caste has been stepping outside of its assigned place. And we are seeing a backlash in both societies as a result of this reorganization of pre-existing, long-standing hierarchies. And this backlash and pushback is in some ways, interestingly enough, expressing itself in similar ways. A rightward movement, the term reverse casteism, reverse racism. We're the ones that are being attacked. We're the ones that are being discriminated against. It's strikingly similar. It's shocking. It's actually not shocking because human beings respond the same way to certain similar ways to similar stimuli. But I think it's worth noting the parallel responses in both societies by the upper caste, using similar language without necessarily being even aware of what the other is doing. I just think that this is an indication of the fact that change has an impact on the responses of the people who are at the upper caste. And I think that we also, I have a tremendous sense of how can I put this? I have a sense of awe at the tenacity of a caste system. Caste systems are tremendously inventive and will work very hard to maintain itself. They will do whatever it takes to maintain it. I've almost come to view caste systems as an entity unto itself, in which everyone in the caste system, from the upper caste, middle caste, lower caste, interestingly enough, has a stake in the system as it exists. And so when the system begins to change, that's when the trouble begins. But the trouble is what John Lewis, the civil rights activist and leader and congressman, says is good trouble, because this is the kind of thing that needs to happen to shake things up. And then finally, I was going to say that when you speak about language and should there be another term, I don't use the term caste system because I seek to use the word caste system. I think that it's quite interesting that both societies are finding ways to create new, use or adopt new language that somehow might spark the imagination of those that they're trying to reach. So that, interestingly, one society is moving toward the idea of incorporating the theory, the idea of racism, while partly because caste, once it's used too long, begins to lose its force. And people deny that it exists, and they believe that this is not a problem. And if you mention a problem, you're the problem, you're the one that's casteist. And the same language occurs in the United States, where people will say, you know, there is no racism. One very prominent leader at the very, top of our society in this country said, "I'm the least racist person you will ever meet." So if there are no racists and racism doesn't exist, then what do you do to describe and to get the attention of people to try to circumvent what is literally toxic to everyone in that system? And so that's why I'm an advocate for the use of the term caste here, because that's a new way of looking at the structure of this country. And racism can be used as a new way to look at the structure of what is going on in India. And that's where I see the bridge coming in. And I will just conclude by saying that I myself am the daughter of survivors of the Jim Crow caste system. And my father was a Tuskegee Airman, and because of the caste system, he was not permitted to fly. He was not permitted to get a job working as a pilot, as good and as amazing as they actually all were. They were considered among the best pilots that the United States had produced in World War II. So what did he do? He became a builder of bridges. And I, as his daughter, feel that that's also my calling as well. So thank you.